Coast Guard hits Venezuelan boat. A vessel was taken down by the U.S. Navy, and in the video you can actually see the explosion, with fentanyl packages floating among the wreckage. Actions like this have been happening over the past few weeks, which has cranked up tensions between the United States and the Venezuelan government. What you're going to learn today isn't just about boats blowing up in the middle of the sea. It's about how a gang born inside Venezuelan prisons became so dangerous that it pushed the United States to abandon decades of military protocols. It's about how the Tren de Aragua forced the world's biggest superpower to shoot first and not bother asking questions later. On September 2, 2025, President Donald Trump shocked the world by announcing that U.S. armed forces had carried out a lethal strike against a vessel suspected of transporting drugs in the southern Caribbean. 11 people died instantly when a missile slammed into the speedboat in international waters. Trump didn't just confirm the attack, he actually shared the dramatic video of the operation on his social media accounts. The footage shows a boat being completely obliterated by a precision projectile, causing an explosion visible from miles away. The American president put it bluntly, "Just minutes ago, we literally blew up a boat loaded with drugs." But this wasn't some one-off mission. Just 2 weeks later, on September 16th, Trump announced a second strike, this time killing 3 people aboard another Venezuelan vessel. The pattern was clear. America had completely flipped its strategy in fighting Caribbean drug trafficking. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spelled out the message behind these moves. We're sending a very direct message to traffickers. If you come to the United States with your drugs, you're not going back home. The era of intercept and arrest was over. Now it was straight-up elimination. To get the weight of these attacks, you gotta know the target. The Tren de Aragua, a criminal organization that was born in Venezuelan prisons and became one of the most feared gangs in Latin America. The name might sound odd, but the meaning is simple and scary. Train of Aragua, a nod to how fast they spread across the continent. Founded inside Tocaron prison in Venezuela's Aragua state, this cartel started as just another prison gang. But in less than 2 decades, it turned into a sophisticated criminal machine that controls turf stretching from Venezuela all the way to the U.S. They're not just drug traffickers, they're a structured terrorist organization that dominates human trafficking, extortion, kidnappings, and assassinations. What makes the Tren de Aragua especially dangerous is its ability to adapt and infiltrate. Unlike other cartels tied to fixed territories, they move like criminal nomads, setting up cells in different countries and building networks among Venezuelan migrants, often through coercion and threats. The Trump administration officially labeled the Tren de Aragua a foreign terrorist organization in February 2025, a designation that lets the U.S. government use extraordinary measures against its members. Even more dramatically, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was invoked, claiming that the gang had invaded the United States under direction of the Venezuelan government. Giovanni Vicente Mosquera Serrano, considered one of the cartel's top leaders, was sanctioned and indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice on drug trafficking charges. U.S. authorities estimate the Tren de Aragua already has operational cells in more than 10 states, from New York to Colorado, where they've been tied to a string of violent crimes. The September strikes marked a fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy toward the region. For the first time since the War on Terror in the Middle East, America chose to use preemptive lethal force in international waters against non-state actors. The operation was carefully planned. U.S. warships, including Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, were strategically deployed in the southern Caribbean after intel flagged an increase in Venezuelan drug trafficking. The Coast Guard, working with the Navy, set up an interception perimeter that operated more like a kill zone. What caught analysts' eyes was the precision of the strikes. The vessels were hit with high-precision guided missiles, likely Hellfires or something similar, launched from drones or warships. The choice of weaponry wasn't random. These projectiles are designed for total destruction, leaving no survivors or recoverable evidence. Marco Rubio defended the legality of the operations, arguing that the strikes took place in international waters against targets engaged in terrorist activities. But international law experts questioned the legal grounds, especially since there was no attempt to intercept or verify the cargo before pulling the trigger. The most controversial revelation was that at least one of the vessels was heading back to the Venezuelan coast when it was struck, raising doubts about whether it really posed an imminent threat to the United States. Members of Congress began pushing for more details on the criteria used to authorize lethal force. The global reaction to the strikes was immediate and split. Some Caribbean countries, like Trinidad and Tobago, praised the U.S. actions as necessary to fight drug trafficking. But most Latin American nations voiced serious concern about the militarization of the Caribbean. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro denounced the attacks as acts of piracy and claimed his country was facing the greatest military threat in 100 years. At a dramatic press conference in Caracas, Maduro said 8 U.S. warships and 1,200 missiles had been deployed against Venezuela, calling it preparation for invasion. Puerto Rico's governor, Jennifer Gonzalez, was one of the few officials to openly support the strikes, thanking the Trump administration for fighting the drug cartels in our hemisphere. Her stance reflected the reality that Caribbean territories are often used as trafficking routes by Venezuelan networks. On the flip side, countries like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico expressed concern about the precedent being set. Latin American diplomats privately argued that the U.S. had basically declared international waters a war zone, a reading that could let other world powers justify similar military actions. The European Union put out a cautious statement, voicing concern over the disproportionate use of force and calling on all parties to respect international maritime law. China and Russia, usually quick to criticize U.S. military moves, condemned the strikes as imperialist aggression and offered diplomatic backing to Venezuela. The fallout from the strikes rippled far beyond the waters where they happened. Venezuelan communities in the U.S. reported a sharp rise in harassment and discrimination, with immigration authorities stepping up deportation operations under the claim of fighting Tren de Aragua infiltration. In March 2025, 200 detainees allegedly tied to the gang were deported to El Salvador, even though a court order had blocked deportations. This move marked a controversial expansion of the anti-cartel fight, using third countries as destinations for deportees Venezuela refused to take back. The economic impact was immediate too. Commercial shipping companies started avoiding certain Caribbean routes out of fear of being mistaken for suspect vessels. Maritime insurers hiked premiums for ships operating in the region, piling extra costs onto legitimate trade. Local fishermen, especially in smaller Caribbean countries, said they were scared to go out to sea after the strikes. On September 12th, Coast Guard crews boarded a civilian fishing boat they suspected of carrying drugs, but found no contraband, showing how the new policy was hitting legitimate economic activity. Venezuela didn't sit idle after the U.S. attacks. Maduro announced large-scale military drills in Venezuelan territorial waters, involving the Navy, Air Force, and National Guard units. The exercises included simulations of defense against naval and air attacks, sending a clear signal the country was gearing up for possible escalation. The Venezuelan government also ramped up its military cooperation with Russia and China. Russian warships made demonstrative visits to Venezuelan ports, while Chinese military advisors were spotted inspecting Venezuelan naval facilities. This move worried American analysts, who feared the setup of a permanent rival military presence in the Caribbean. Even more provocatively, Venezuelan authorities began intercepting U.S. commercial vessels in waters they claimed as Venezuelan territory. At least 3 American-flagged cargo ships were forced to stop for inspection by Venezuelan Navy boats, creating new flashpoints between the two countries. Venezuela's official rhetoric also grew more aggressive. Maduro's ministers started openly talking about self-defense against American acts of piracy and suggested that U.S. warships in international waters near Venezuela could be considered legitimate targets. The events of September 2025 marked a paradigm shift in U.S.-Venezuela relations that goes way beyond the fight against drug trafficking. For the first time since the 1989 invasion of Panama, the U.S. used direct lethal military force against Latin American targets in peacetime. Foreign policy experts see the strikes as part of a broader Trump administration strategy to reassert U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The message was clear. America would not tolerate threats to its national security coming from criminal organizations backed by hostile governments. But the strategy carries serious risks. By making lethal force the first option, the U.S. may have set a dangerous precedent that other countries could use to justify their own military actions. China, for example, could argue it has the same right to strike vessels suspected of smuggling in the South China Sea. And whether the strikes are even effective against the Tren de Aragua is up for debate. Criminal groups like this are known for adapting fast. Instead of scaling back operations, the cartel could just switch tactics, using smaller boats, different routes, or entirely new methods of transport. The September strikes created a new geopolitical reality in the Caribbean that's likely to last for years. The U.S. effectively set up a de facto military exclusion zone under the label of an anti-narcotics operation, fundamentally shifting the power balance in the region. For Venezuela, the strikes were both a humiliation and an opportunity. Humiliation because they showed the country couldn't protect vessels near its own waters. Opportunity because they gave justification for beefing up militarization and partnering more with U.S. rivals. Smaller Caribbean countries are in an especially tough spot. They depend on the U.S. for security, but also rely on regional trade for survival. The militarization of Caribbean waters forces them to pick sides in a conflict they'd rather avoid. The long-term impact could be the creation of two rival military spheres of influence in the Caribbean, one American and one tied to Russia, China, and Venezuela. That split could turn a traditionally peaceful region into a new stage for great power competition. The U.S. Coast Guard strikes on Venezuelan cartel boats marked the start of a new era in hemispheric relations. What began as an anti-drug operation turned into a military show of force that rewrote the rules of the game in the Caribbean. The implications go way beyond the fight against the Tren de Aragua. The U.S. showed it's ready to use lethal force as a first-line tool in regional foreign policy, while Venezuela answered by seeking military partnerships with America's adversaries. For people in the region, especially Venezuelan communities in the U.S., the consequences are immediate and personal. The military escalation has created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affects thousands of innocent families. What we saw in September 2025 could just be the beginning. With both sides boosting their military capacities and hardening their positions, the Caribbean may be heading toward becoming the next flashpoint between the United States and the Russia-China-Venezuela bloc. The big question is whether diplomacy still has a shot at easing these tensions before they blow up into something much more dangerous. For now, the Caribbean waters look calm on the surface, but the undercurrents point to storms ahead.